Welcome to another edition of Southbank Investment Daily. Well, this week what I'd like to really think about is geopolitics and how the global position is really deteriorating quite quickly. So, what we've really been engaged in for much of the last 70 years has been a rules-based order. And you've had international organizations that have uh, basically banded together and ensured that there was a modicum of global peace. So the primary reason for the UN wasn't in order to give an individual right to every country, but rather that there would be a talking place for the major powers in order to ensure that there wasn't going to be a surprise nuclear war. And then, of course, you had lots of institutions that were created in the aftermath of the Second World War, like the IMF, the World Bank, and the hegemony of the US dollar overarching. And then, following the floating of the US dollar, you had the petrodollar system. And now what we have is probably the most significant threat to that rules-based order we've seen, because there is a growing perception that the USA is overstretched. Now, you have people like Janet Yellen going out and talking about that the USA has no problem engaging in Ukraine and Israel simultaneously, and they have the money, it's not a problem. But when you think about the range of possible outcomes that are underway, then what we can only conclude is that the geopolitical condition is deteriorating. The number of questions that are being asked is increasing, and the ability of the USA to further extend itself into additional theaters of war, that's going to be put under pressure. And I was just thinking over the last few weeks that it is looking increasingly likely that Russia is winning in Ukraine. Ukraine has spent a ton of money, several tens of thousands of lives, and gained nothing from their summer offensive. Now we're in the middle of winter, and it is really a question of whether Russia is going to be prepared to press their advantage or whether they're going to negotiate and extract very favorable terms. But of course, what's happening in Ukraine is old news. And unless there's a big surprise there, it's not going to affect the way that markets behave. But one thing we know for certain is that Russia is launching a large number of munitions every day, so is Ukraine, and these things don't grow on trees. They have to be manufactured somewhere. And one of the most acute forms of defense is an active offense. So there's going to have to be significant investment in additional new manufacturing capacity for munitions. Then, of course, we have what's going on in Israel. Now, we have the Israeli stock market here, and it has rebounded over the last 6 weeks. It fell quite precipitously in the aftermath of Hamas invading and taking several hundred hostages. And now the stock market has pretty much got right back up to where it was ahead of the invasion. Regardless of the trajectory or the length of time that the conflict lasts, one thing we can certainly say is that it is a distraction from what's going on in Ukraine. And it's an additional theater of war that requires attention, time to be spoken about, meetings to be had, and that obviously divides attention. But then, of course, the geopolitical theater is not on an intermission. There are lots of other things happening at the same time. So one thing that I thought was particularly interesting right now is that what's happening in the Philippines. There's a rather interesting situation where the Philippines basically beached a boat on a shoal and then claimed that, and they did that as a way of pressing the ownership that the Philippines has of that shoal. And China now is attempting to take it over because the boat that was landed there is starting to break apart. And in order to ensure that it stays in one piece, then it's going to have to be loaded up with concrete. But in order to get there, you're going to have to run the blockade of Chinese ships, Coast Guard ships, fishing ships, and naval ships that are stopping the Philippines pressing their claim to this shoal. Now, the one important point, of course, for the Philippines is that they have international law on their side. But more to the point, whatever people think about Taiwan, the Philippines does have a mutual defense agreement with the USA. And the efforts that are underway right now, where you have Chinese Coast Guard ships ramming Filipino ships, well, this obviously is an additional source of stress. And then I think it's also worth considering that what's going on with Chevron. So there was a major oil find made in Guyana in 2015, and Hess then had a big piece of that, and Chevron's attempting to buy Hess in order to get that. But then there was and I'm going to put this in inverted commas, referendum in Venezuela last week. And Venezuela is now claiming about 2/3 of the land mass of Guyana. They want to move in and they want to take over that new oil field. Now, that is obviously a major geopolitical threat. Of course, it's an open question whether Venezuela has the wherewithal to engage in that kind of conflict, or whether they're actually just saber rattling and that it is more in an effort to try and curry favor domestically. This is certainly not the first time we've noticed that saber rattling on the international front has been used to firm up the domestic base. One might argue that the very original incursion into Crimea in 2014 by Russia was exactly that kind of action being performed by Vladimir Putin. But now what we're looking at here is that there are problems in Ukraine, Israel, then in the Philippines and Guyana. So instead of talking about being on two fronts, what we're really starting to think now about is that there are potentially 4 fronts, and then that doesn't particularly exclude the potential that there couldn't be more. What happens if, for example, Iran is dragged into the Israeli-Hamas conflict? And what happens if the travel of oil tankers through the Straits of Hormuz is interfered with? These are obviously geopolitical potential problems. And then, of course, there is the additional problem. What happens if China decides that they're going to press their territorial claim and take over Taiwan? So when we think then about what all that means, well, it's a pretty impressive bull market environment for the defense sector. So the Europe stocks total market aerospace and defense index has broken on the upside now, and this has, I think, really been led higher by Rolls-Royce. Then when we look at the US equivalent, the iShares US Aerospace and Defense ETF is breaking on the upside. This is a new all-time high. It's the completion of a 3-year consolidation. And this is one of the easy conclusions. There's just no way that investing in additional new military hardware is going to be avoided. The ability of the USA to act as the global policeman is very clearly in question. And until they can demonstrate that they can actually be effective in that role, well, we're going to see an increasing number of regimes attempting to press their cases and to test it. And this is obviously a recipe for a lot of geopolitical tensions, and I suspect we're going to be talking about it for a good long time in the future. And I think with that, I'll leave you for the week, and I'll wish all the best to all of you.